And now a short story from 2 Cents Returned. Function and Form. It was the same morning as ever for Mr. Samuel Etheridge of 28 Ingleston Place. He rose to the chirping of swallows outside his window, cleaned himself up, made a spot of fresh coffee, put on his suit, and made his way to the bus stop on the corner. The 54B line ran from the far stretches of town, swooping through the small developments just past the industrial park, over to the Gladburn Hotel, and on to Ingleston Place, just another nondescript lane of row houses, before heading to the commercial centre of Swarsby. The 7:45 bus would take exactly 20 minutes to get from Ingleston Place to the Plaza of Tomorrow, where Mr. Etheridge would walk the further 8 minutes to the towering Ministry of Personal Connections building, and a final 2 minutes to exchange pleasantries with the doorman and the receptionist to find Mr. Etheridge at his desk at 8:15 prompt. His desk resided in the cubicle, third on the left, second row, sandwiched between Mr. Paul Harrington and Mrs. Rita Norman. Every morning, Mr. Etheridge would rifle through the stack of papers on his desk that had been placed there by the overnight crew, check his emails, make a phone call to the project manager informing her of any developments in his client folder, and set about researching his new clientele. The department that Mr. Etheridge worked in was tasked with surveillance of all Swarsby individuals who live in the 8IO section of the P6WS postal code. Now typically this only meant monitoring their financial transactions and social media pages, but sometimes required a house call or two. On this day, Mr. Etheridge was handed a file on a Mr. Oscar Braithwaite of No. 2 Woodland Way. What struck Mr. Etheridge as odd was this particular client was much further afield than any of his usual sort. As such, Mr. Etheridge put in a call to his supervisor to confirm the paperwork, who then followed up with a correspondent from the Ministry of Record Keeping, who verified the case file with their liaison in the Ministry of Housing Affairs, who proceeded to send a courier with a completed investigation form to Mr. Etheridge from the Ministry of Information. Seeing as how Mr. Etheridge was unfamiliar with a certain Mr. Braithwaite, he filled out a form for on-site visitation, which he sent to his supervisor, who co-signed said form, forwarded it to the clerk at the Ministry of Government Officials, who gave it to the head of the Visitation Department, who, seeing everything in order, sent a further courier from the Ministry of Information to let Mr. Etheridge know the good news. Mr. Etheridge pulled up the bus timetable and found that the 27 line would take him from the Plaza of Tomorrow out to the fringes of Swarsby, where he would need to walk a further 20 minutes to Woodland Way. He picked up his phone and placed a call to his supervisor, letting her know his intentions of taking the 27 bus out to visit Mr. Braithwaite, and proceeded to pick up his coat before heading to the door. The 27 bus had 14 stops along its line, 8 of which Mr. Etheridge would have to stay on before reaching the out-of-town terminal, where he could walk along the by-road to Woodland Way. Once there, Mr. Etheridge found a seemingly endless dirt path that stretched far back into the woods and out of sight. He followed the path under the canopy into the forest as it began to snake around the trees. The path went over a few hills, down by a spring, and finally came to a clearing where it led to a house standing alone. This house was quite a break from the usual cut-and-paste row houses that Mr. Etheridge's typical clientele resided in that it was approximately 3 stories high with a wraparound front porch and exquisite marble columns supporting a masterpiece of brickwork. Mr. Etheridge approached the porch and went up a few stairs where he could make out a small brass No. 2 on the front door. He rang the doorbell and adjusted his tie in preparation for meeting Mr. Braithwaite or whomever might greet him at the door. A minute or two went by and Mr. Etheridge tried the doorbell again. He tried to look through the curtains of the window to the side of the door, but couldn't seem to make anything out. He tried the knocker on the front door and waited a few more minutes. At this point, Mr. Etheridge was unsure what to do. He had never encountered a case where he had made a house call and no one was there to receive him. He tried the doorbell every few minutes as he periodically checked his watch and tapped his foot against the wooden panels of the porch. Just as Mr. Etheridge decided to turn back towards the path, he could hear the front door unlock. He turned to face the front door, anticipating someone to open it and invite him in. As nothing of the sort happened, Mr. Etheridge approached the door and stated his name and position, as well as reason for visitation. With no response, Mr. Etheridge knocked again and called out for anyone within the house. He was curious about who might have unlocked the door and why they might not be answering him. He very cautiously reached for the doorknob and opened the door. As he stepped through, he found himself in a small room no larger than an elevator, with blank walls and a metal floor. The door quickly closed and locked behind him, setting Mr. Etheridge into a state of fear. The metal floor slid away, sending Mr. Etheridge sliding down a metal chute. He was shot out into a dark, slightly damp room with a cobblestone floor. The chute closed behind him, and a small light bulb in the middle of the room flickered on. He looked around at what appeared to be figures clumped around the sides of the walls. The stagnant, musty air quickly enveloped Mr. Etheridge. As he crept towards the center of the room, he could make out clearer forms of bodies, men in suits, crumpled up in heaps. Suddenly, a speaker on the ceiling of the room crackled to life. Ah, Mr. Etheridge, we had such high hopes for you. A perfect attendance record, not a day off work in your life, mild-mannered man who lives alone, never married. Your record-keeping is something truly to be admired. But you see, sir, you broke protocol. You of all people should know that we do things by the book. Not only did you not bring with you a completed misconnections form to leave at the residence of your client, but you actively entered their residence without express permission. You didn't report back to your supervisor, Mrs. Milton. You didn't even attempt to go back to fill out an RR54 form, which if verified, would have allowed you to enter this place just fine. I'm sorry, Mr. Etheridge, but you see, the Swarsby Council has no place for degenerates such as yourself. We need honest civil servants that will follow the rules to invade someone's privacy, rather than just doing so on one's own volition. Such a curious thing as well. Every employee we've sent to investigate Mr. Braithwaite's case has done just the same. Don't take it to heart, Mr. Etheridge. Personally, I blame the entire education system for not instilling our children with proper decency. Well, anyhow, thank you for your contribution these past few years. You are going to be a tough one to replace, I can assure you. At that moment, the speaker clicked off and the room went dark. The walls started to creak and rumble as the sound of fluid rising just behind them reverberated throughout the room. Metal vents slid open in the ceiling, and a toxic gas spewed out, completely entrapping Mr. Etheridge. As he coughed and wheezed, trying to find a way out, he sank to his knees. Crawling and gasping for air, he made his way to the wall on the far side of the room, collapsed flat on his stomach, and died. In the paper the following morning, an obituary was released for Mr. Samuel Walter Etheridge, claiming that he was a severely depressed man who went out into the woods to take his own life. At the end of it all, the piece simply put, an unfortunate circumstance of a man lost to his own efforts, an ill-fitting cog for the well-oiled machine.